So, Queen Camilla is supposedly suffering from severe mental exhaustion and major depression, and the story about why she's suddenly so unwell completely falls apart the second you look at the timeline. Because according to palace insiders, this entire health crisis didn't start after months of public pressure or media scrutiny. It started the moment King Charles III made it clear he was about to hand Princess Anne full control over the royal family's private finances. That's not a coincidence. That's not bad timing. That's the kind of detail that makes you go, wait, what? And honestly, the fact that nobody in the palace is willing to answer the obvious question is the weird part. So before we get into the details, if you're new here, we break down royal drama as it actually happens. So hit subscribe us. It helps more than you know. Now here's where things get interesting. According to the claims circulating around the palace, King Charles had been considering a major change in the way royal finances were handled. And we're not talking about some minor household budget. We're talking about the privy purse, the financial system connected to the monarch's private income and official household expenses. Whoever has influence over that system isn't simply handling numbers. They're sitting close to one of the most important sources of financial power inside the institution. And according to these reports, Charles wanted Princess Anne to take on a much greater role. And honestly, on the surface, the decision makes sense. Anne has spent decades building a reputation for discipline, efficiency, and relentless work. She's not known for unnecessary drama. She's not interested in creating a spectacle. She shows up, does the job, and moves on. So when Charles supposedly decided that Anne was the right person to help oversee a more disciplined financial structure, it looked like a practical decision. But according to the story, Camilla didn't see it that way. She allegedly saw Anne's growing influence as a direct threat to her own position. And this is where the timeline becomes extremely important. Because if Camilla's reported health problems were simply the result of public pressure, you would expect the situation to develop gradually. You'd expect months of visible exhaustion. You'd expect staff to notice changes. You'd expect a pattern. Instead, the allegations claim that her deterioration became noticeable right around the same period that Charles began discussing Anne's expanded financial authority. And that's what supposedly made people inside the palace suspicious. Now I want to pause here because these are serious allegations, and there has been no official confirmation that Camilla fabricated a medical condition or attempted to manipulate the king. But according to the story being circulated, something much bigger was happening behind closed doors. Camilla allegedly sought out a private physician in Chelsea. And the claim isn't simply that she visited a doctor because she wasn't feeling well. The allegation is that she asked for documentation describing her condition as severe mental exhaustion and major depression, supposedly linking the condition directly to the pressures of royal life. And if that were true, it would completely change the story. Because suddenly, Charles wouldn't just be dealing with a disagreement about money. He would believe his wife was seriously struggling. And that's exactly where the alleged strategy becomes interesting. According to the reports, Camilla began presenting herself to Charles as emotionally exhausted, physically drained, and unable to cope with the pressure surrounding her position. She allegedly broke down in front of him. She reportedly told him that she needed stability. She supposedly argued that having greater control over the royal household's financial affairs would give her a sense of purpose and security. Think about the logic of that. The person supposedly suffering from the pressure of royal life is asking for more authority inside the institution. And according to the story, that authority was exactly what Charles had been preparing to give to Anne. So suddenly, the health issue and the financial dispute were connected. Camilla allegedly wanted Charles to reconsider his decision. But according to the claims, she didn't stop there. She reportedly wanted assurances about royal assets and symbolic jewelry associated with the late Queen Elizabeth II. She allegedly wanted guarantees that would protect her own position and provide security for her children from her previous marriage. Again, none of this has been publicly established as fact. But within the story being circulated, this is presented as the moment when Princess Anne began to suspect that something wasn't right. Because Anne supposedly noticed inconsistencies. The timing, the phone calls, the sudden changes in behavior. The difference between what Camilla was saying publicly and what she was allegedly doing privately. And according to the reports, Anne began quietly paying attention. Now, this is where the story gets almost cinematic. The allegation claims that Camilla was making private calls whenever Charles left the room. She supposedly became extremely careful about who she spoke to and when she made those calls. And Anne, being Anne, allegedly didn't ignore the pattern. Instead, the story claims that she began investigating. According to the reports, someone connected to the palace staff eventually obtained information about communications between Camilla and the physician. And allegedly, the evidence appeared to connect the doctor's name with repeated calls and messages. That was enough, according to the story, for Anne to confront the physician directly. And this is where the entire situation supposedly collapsed. The doctor allegedly insisted that the medical assessment had been legitimate. But according to the claims, Anne confronted him with communications that appeared to show something different. The allegation is that the doctor eventually admitted that Camilla had asked him to prepare a diagnosis that exaggerated or fabricated her condition. Again, there is no verified evidence presented here establishing that such a confession actually occurred. But in this dramatic version of events, the alleged confession became the turning point. Because now Anne supposedly had something she could take directly to Charles. Not rumors. Not palace gossip. Evidence. A medical document. Communications. And according to the story, testimony from the doctor himself. Imagine Charles sitting in his study after spending weeks believing that his wife was genuinely struggling. He had supposedly been worried about her. He had supposedly reconsidered his financial plans because he didn't want to put additional pressure on her. And then Anne allegedly walks into the room with evidence suggesting the entire situation had been manipulated. That wouldn't just be a disagreement. That would be a complete breakdown of trust. According to the reports, Charles was stunned. And instead of handling the matter privately, he allegedly called an emergency meeting involving senior members of the royal household. That's where the story becomes even more dramatic. The physician was supposedly brought into the meeting. The allegations claimed that he explained how the medical documentation had been prepared and admitted that Camilla had influenced the process. If that meeting actually happened as described, it would have placed Charles in an impossible position. Because at that point, the question wasn't simply whether Camilla should control the privy purse. The question was whether the king could trust his wife. And according to the story, Charles made a decision. He allegedly revoked the authority that had been under consideration. He supposedly removed Camilla from involvement in financial and internal household decisions. And then came the most shocking claim of all. Camilla was allegedly ordered to leave Buckingham Palace. Immediately. According to the dramatic reports, there was no lengthy negotiation, no gradual separation, no public ceremony. Just a sudden order that she leave. And this is where the story reaches its most emotional moment. The reports describe Camilla gathering her belongings while palace staff remained nearby. Outside, rain was supposedly falling across the grounds. She allegedly walked toward the exit in tears, asking Charles how he could treat her this way after everything they had shared. It's the kind of scene that sounds almost written for television. But the central question remains. Was this actually a health crisis? Or was the health crisis being portrayed as part of a much larger power struggle? According to the allegations, Camilla's explanation was that she needed compassion, support, and protection. But her alleged demands were about authority, financial control, jewelry, and inheritance. And that's why the story has become so controversial. Because if the allegations were true, the issue wouldn't simply be about money. It would be about using vulnerability as leverage. It would be about turning someone's compassion against them. And that's a completely different kind of palace conflict. Princess Anne, meanwhile, supposedly became the person who stood between the king and that alleged manipulation. She didn't need a dramatic speech. She didn't need a public confrontation. According to the story, she simply noticed that something didn't add up. And that's probably the most interesting part of the entire narrative. Because Anne has always had a reputation for being practical. She doesn't chase attention. She doesn't need headlines. She doesn't seem interested in competing for popularity. Her strength is that she watches, listens, and gets the work done. And according to this story, that's exactly what allowed her to uncover the alleged scheme. The bigger issue, though, is what happens after trust is destroyed. Even if Charles eventually changes his mind about the financial arrangements, can he ever look at Camilla the same way again? That's the question hanging over the entire situation. Because money can be replaced. Titles can change. Positions can be reassigned. But trust is different. Once someone believes that their compassion has been deliberately manipulated, rebuilding that relationship becomes incredibly difficult. And that's why the alleged fallout would be much bigger than one argument over the privy purse. It would affect the entire balance of power inside the monarchy. Who controls resources? Who advises the king? Who has access to sensitive financial decisions? And perhaps most importantly, who does Charles actually trust when the palace doors are closed? According to the dramatic version of this story, Anne emerged stronger because she didn't fight for power. She simply protected the institution she believed she was responsible for protecting, and Camilla allegedly lost ground because she tried to secure more of it. But again, it's important to separate the allegations from established facts. There is no confirmed public evidence establishing that Camilla fabricated a medical diagnosis, bribed a doctor, secretly manipulated Charles over royal finances, or was expelled from Buckingham Palace in the manner described here. Those claims should be treated as an unverified palace drama narrative, not as confirmed royal history. Still, the reason the story is so compelling is obvious. It combines money, marriage, family loyalty, inheritance, jealousy, and one of the most recognizable royal figures in Britain. And at the center of it all is Princess Anne, the person who supposedly saw what everyone else missed, the person who allegedly followed the clues, and the person who supposedly brought the evidence straight to the king. So now the question is simple. If this story is false, why has it generated so much speculation? And if even part of it were true, what would it mean for the future balance of power inside the royal household? Would Charles continue relying on Anne? Would Camilla attempt to rebuild trust? Would the palace eventually address the rumors? Or would everyone simply remain silent and allow the speculation to grow? Because that's what happens when a palace refuses to explain what's happening behind closed doors. The silence becomes part of the story. And for now, the biggest takeaway isn't simply the alleged downfall of Camilla. It's the image of Princess Anne quietly watching from the sidelines while one of the most dramatic power struggles inside the monarchy supposedly unfolds around her. No shouting. No grand performance. Just observation. And if there's one thing this story tries to teach us, it's that sometimes the person saying the least is the person paying the closest attention. So, if you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure you subscribe us, because royal stories like this are only getting more complicated. We'll see you in the next one.